Hello, and welcome back. Please stand and join me for our opening verse. So standing with your feet together and feeling this strengthening force coming up from below, making you tall and strong, kind of like a plant growing up towards the sun. And this other force coming down from above, which is grounding you to the planet, making you relaxed, almost like a moonbeam. So one is strengthening and the other is relaxing. And see if you can imagine that in your body. Okay, morning verse. I look into the world in which the sun is shining, in which the stars are sparkling, in which the stones repose, where living plants are growing, where sentient beasts are living, where we, soul-gifted, give the spirit a dwelling place. I look into the soul that lives within my being. God's spirit moves and weaves in sunlight and in soul light, in heights of worlds without, in depths of soul within. To thee, Creator Spirit, I turn my heart and seek that strength and grace and skill for learning and for working in me may live and grow. Okay, let's sing Jubilate Deo. Here we go. Jubilate Deo, Jubilate Deo, Alleluia. 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 Okay, now let's do our salute to Rome. First in Latin, then in English. I'm not quite sure how long I'm going to keep this up here, so see if you can start to memorize the Latin. Here we go. O Roma nobilis, orbis et domina, omnium urbium excellentissima, salutem dicimus tibi per omnia, te benedicimus, salve per saecula. And then in English, O noble Rome, the circle and mistress of all cities most excellent, we give greetings to you among all. To you we give blessing, salute through the year. And please have a seat. All right, Let's do some mental math. Your first one is 160 times 5. 160 times 5 is what? And the answer is 800. Let's have a look. So I divide 160 in half, I get 80 times 10. And whenever I times a number by 10, it's like adding another zero. It's like adding another place. Okay? You could also imagine that this has a decimal point here, even though we don't normally write it. And so timesing it by 10 moves the decimal point over 1, and we have to fill in that space with a 0. So we're going to get 800, okay? Let's do another one. 122 times 5. 122 times 5 is what? And the answer is 610. So, 122 times 5. Now, if dividing big numbers in half is a struggle, you can break them up, right? So 122 is like 120 plus 2. Now half of 120 is 60, just like half of 12 is 6, and half of 2 is 1, so you get 61, right? 61 times 5. I'm sorry. We would make this times 10, because that's the trick. And then it's like adding a 0 to 61. So you're left with 610. All right. One more. 145 times 5. 145 times 5 is what? The answer is 725. Now let's look at that one. Again, if it's tricky for you to divide big numbers into, break them down. 140 plus 5. All right? And half of 140 is 70, just like half of 14 is 7. And half of 5 is 2 and 5/10. So I add that to the 70, and we're going to get 72 and 5/10. All right, and then times 10, because that's our trick. And then, rather than adding a 0, I'm just going to move the place value over 1, the decimal over 1, and then I have 725. So I'm just explaining these things a little bit more in depth for anybody that's had a challenge with these. All right, so yesterday we heard about the Etruscans, these people that had a big impact on Roman culture through their art, through their writing, through their architecture, through their money, through their jewelry. And, you know, it's safe to say that so much of the Roman culture came from the Etruscans and also from the Greeks. We're going to hear a little bit more about how that happened later today. But, you know, I'll mention again, as I've said before, that the Romans were not so good at inventing new things culturally. That's not necessarily true of technology. They were actually did bring a lot of new developments in technology into the world. But in terms of culture and art and music and those sorts of things, the Romans didn't bring a lot of new things. They were not so good at that. They were not so inventive in that way, but they were good at imitating. And so they absorbed a lot of this from the Etruscans. And they absorbed some Greek ideas through the Etruscans and then also directly from the Greeks themselves after the Romans conquered them. But that's another story. So we also heard how this culture came at a pretty hefty price for the Romans, that they eventually invited Etruscans to be their kings, and for a while it was going well until a particularly wicked, power-hungry, greedy one named Tarquinius Superbus came to power and wielded his power like a wicked tyrant with an iron fist. And, it was like a reign of terror for the Romans. And his sons weren't any better. They were not helping matters one bit. And we heard about how Tarquinius basically got rid of anybody who challenged him or who didn't do his will, or sometimes he just got rid of them because he wanted their stuff, and how he did away with the family of the king that he himself killed, who was Servius Tullius, all except for this one relative, and that was Brutus. And it was because Brutus seemed to be mad. He seemed like a crazy person, like he was missing some pieces there. And so Tarquinius thought there's no reason to kill another person needlessly, which sounds strange from somebody who was willing to do it pretty much at will, okay? But for some reason he spared Brutus, and that was that. When I left you with this question yesterday, I said, what do you think Brutus is doing? What's he doing? What do you think he's going to do with this kind of pretending act? And I want you to think about this for a minute and pause the video and discuss with your parent or teacher or with your peers, or you can just think about what your own answer to that question would be if there's nobody else around. So what do you think Brutus is going to do? Go ahead and pause the video and discuss now. Okay. So assuming that you've done that, I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen next. Not yet, because you're going to hear about it soon. All right. Now, I want to briefly go back a couple of lessons to the founding of Rome with Romulus and Remus and the 7 hills, because today you're actually going to use the outline that you did yesterday to write a composition. But you're going to write it from the perspective of one of the shepherds who was with Romulus and Remus at the founding of Rome. So in other words, you're one of these shepherds on the sideline observing all this. So let's briefly recall the events. So there were the 7 hills and the brothers unable to choose which hill. So they used augury, flights of birds, to decide. And, then there was, Romulus self-proclaiming himself as the king, and then Remus getting resentful. And then there was the dedication of the city through the ritual with the wheat seeds. And then there was the hitching of the cow and the ox to the plow to make the furrow around the city. And then there was the wall building. And meanwhile, Remus is taunting Romulus, trying to get back at his brother for not sharing power with him. And then, jumping over the wall and Romulus pulling out a sword and killing his brother. And then inviting these outlaws into the city to populate it. And so you're going to write about this from the point of view of one of these shepherds. And of course, my expectation is that you will describe what's going on in detail. And we're going to do a word cloud to begin with to come up with some good adjectives and adverbs and nouns and verbs and stuff. like that. But then you're going to also maybe talk about your experience a little bit. So I want you to imagine that you're one of these shepherds. And I don't want you to imagine that you are your modern self, because then you might be tempted to say something like, they did this weird thing called augury where they, watch the flights of birds, and that just didn't make any sense to me. Because if you were a Roman person back then, it would have made sense to you, okay? So when we get to that part of the lesson, I really want you to imagine yourself in the shoes of one of these shepherds. But you can also put your reactions, like, and then King Romulus invited these outlaws in to live in the city, and I'm not sure how that's going to go, and that sort of thing. So, okay. We will do that a little bit later. But for now, let's stand, and we're going to sing Gaudeamus Hodie. With body percussion, I did an extra lesson connected with the last lesson I did on how to do body percussion along with this song. And so we're going to start doing that in this lesson. So let's go to that now. Da, 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 da. Okay, here we go. 2, ready, go. Here we go. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie, Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie, Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie, Hodie. Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus, Gaudeamus Hodie, Hodie. Okay. Please have a seat. All right, so we've heard now how the Romans learned a lot from the Etruscans and then also from the Greeks. One of the things they learned from the Etruscans was architecture, okay? So whereas the Greeks didn't know how to make arches, they just built these square entrances to buildings and temples and what have you, the Etruscans figured out how to build the arch. And so their entrances were like this. And then, of course, the Romans absorbed that from them. Now, imagine what happens if you have this arch and then you make it all the way around. What are you going to end up with? Well, you're going to end up with a dome, a half sphere. And this beautiful facet of architecture made it into Roman culture, and you can still see it today in Rome, okay? Another area in which the Etruscans influenced the Romans was in their writing. And this is some Etruscan writing. Now, I don't think anybody's actually cracked the code of Etruscan language, so I'm not sure that anybody knows what it says, but it might look a little familiar to you, some of the characters. Now, the Etruscans, in turn, got writing from the Greeks. And so you could say, in a way, that Romans learned writing from the Greeks through the Etruscans. All right, so that's kind of interesting how that happened. And something else that the Romans learned from the Etruscans was another way of divination. So we talked about augury, right? And divination is what people would do if they needed an answer. Like, is this a good time to go on this trip? Is this a good sale for me to make, or a business transaction? Or is now a good time to go to battle, right? And so they would consult these priests, whether they were augurs or this other kind of priest, which I'm about to describe, before they did anything big, to see if it was a good time or not. Maybe before they would get married, for example. And so this other form of divination was basically to take an animal and sacrifice it on the altar. And forgive me for this is a little grotesque, but then they would cut open the animal and open it up and examine its organs. And based on how the organs looked, the priest could tell if it was a yes or a no. Now, I don't know how to do that. But anyway, that's how they did it. And I want to also say that many, many cultures in the past, and in some cases still today, practice animal sacrifice out of their belief that this is what the gods require. And so many cultures. So I don't want you to get the idea that, only the Romans did this and you don't like it and that therefore makes them bad or something like that. No, lots and lots of cultures have practiced this throughout the ages. It's not as common today, but in some places they still practice it. So, but speaking of foretelling the future, there was something, or I should say somebody, or some people that the Etruscans lived in great awe and reverence and even fear of. And then later the Romans did too. And these were people that were called Sibyls. Now, a Sibyl was generally female, and a priestess, like a prophetess, somebody, a seer with these kind of very advanced powers, the ability to see the future and to see into the heart of truth. And people said that they would get these messages from the wind and the rain and the storms and the elements of nature. And these Sibyls would often live alone in caves. And they would only come out on the rare occasion that they had something really important to say. Now, there were also oracles, okay, like the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, who did the same thing, basically, okay? So oracle and Sibyl are practically the same interchangeable terms. It means a seer. And, so there was this Sibyl that lived in the countryside outside of Rome. And while Tarquinius Superbus was in his rule, this Sibyl came to visit Rome. And, she seemed almost like an ancient person, so old that nobody even could remember when or where she was born. And she walked, with a gray veil covering her face into the city of Rome, carrying 9 books. And she was as tall, almost it seemed like she was as tall as a pine tree, which almost certainly wasn't true physically, but her spirit, her aura made it seem like she was this kind of great, mighty being, which she was. Very powerful being that nobody dare cross or anger. And so she walked right into the palace, and she said to Tarquinius, In these 9 books is written the entire fate, the entire destiny of Rome from here on out. And I will sell them to you for 1,000 gold pieces. Now, Tarquinius was a rash person, as you might imagine. He wasn't the kind that would sort of stop and ponder something, He just sort of very reactive. And he said, "Pah! Books for 1,000 gold coins? You must be crazy. No way." So she took 3 of them and threw them into the fire. And she said, "Now there are only 6 left, but they are still the same price, 1,000 gold pieces." And again, Tarquinius said, maybe with a little more trepidation this time, that's too expensive for books. So she took 3 more and threw them into the fire. And she said, "Okay, there's only 3 left, and they still cost the same amount." Now, even a king such as Tarquinius, a cruel tyrant, dare not, like I said, go against a Sibyl. And so he started to get kind of scared. And he finally agreed to pay the sum of 1,000 gold pieces for it. And he did, and she gave him the books, and then she went away. And then he quickly looked through the books because he wanted to know what his own fate was. He started to get scared. But he couldn't find anything written about himself. Probably because his fate was written in the books that were thrown into the fire. Now, Tarquinius became increasingly nervous and anxious. He had a hard time sleeping at night after that event. And he started having bad dreams about all those that he had killed. And he started seeing the face of Servius Tullius, the old king that he killed. And he was really haunted by all this. And so he decided one day to make a sacrifice to the gods on his altar. And he did so. But no sooner had he put down the sacrifice when a snake emerged and gobbled it up and disappeared just as quickly. And now he was really frightened because he thought this must be a really bad omen. So he sent his sons and Brutus to go take the long trek over land and sea to visit the Oracle of Delphi to ask what his fate would be and what the meaning of this omen of the snake devouring the sacrifice would be. And so they got to the oracle and they posed the question, and the oracle said, "It is an evil omen indeed, and it means that the rule of Tarquinius will soon come to an end." And then one of the brothers asked, "Well, who will succeed him in ruling Rome?" And she said, "He who kisses his mother first." So the 2 brothers immediately ran out of there and raced each other back to Rome. And Brutus followed, but Brutus did an interesting thing. Now you remember that Brutus would often just fall forward and land on his face as part of his act to make himself seem more mad than he was. And he did this again, and the brothers thought nothing of it because he always did it. But when he landed, he kissed the earth. Because Brutus understood this secret that the priests and the priestesses and the oracles knew. It was code language. And the Oracle of Delphi often spoke in code, often spoke in these kind of riddles. And when she said the first one to kiss the earth, what she meant is the mother earth, the earth mother, because the earth was code language, or the mother was code language for the earth, because the people back then, and many people still now, do look upon the earth as our mother. So Brutus knew this, and he kissed the dirt. Okay. The brothers didn't notice, so they knew nothing of it. So finally, the 3 got back to Rome. I'm sure one of them kissed their earthly mother first because they didn't understand code language. And life went on for a short time. Now there was a battle being fought, and Tarquinius and his sons, as well as Romans, were all fighting this battle. And meanwhile, Brutus was going around Rome secretly talking to Romans about the idea of throwing off Tarquinius and his sons, throwing off the idea of having a king at all, and instead replacing it with something called a republic, which is where no one person has too much power for too long. So this was going on while the battle is happening. Now, at some point during the battle, one of the sons of Tarquinius wanted to take a rest, and so he left the front lines and was heading back towards Rome. And he came upon the house of one of the Roman generals named Collatinus. And in the house was his wife Lucretia. And the prince, the son of Tarquinius, knocked at the door and was, welcomed into the house by Lucretia. And, he decided that, because he just kind of would take whatever he wanted that, he just wanted her to be his wife. But she said no. She was already married, and she had no desire to be his wife anyway. And so, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. And he grabbed her and started to, drag her away. And she would absolutely not have this unto her own death. And so she pulled out a knife and actually plunged it in to her own abdomen. And meanwhile, Tarquinius kind of didn't care about this and just left her there on the earth to bleed out and went back on his way to Rome. Now, not too long later, or a short time later, her husband Collatinus came home and in her last few dying breaths told him what had happened. You must imagine what Collatinus's reaction to this was. So he went and got Brutus and brought him to the house to show him what this son of Tarquinius had done. And so, as a response, they picked up the body of Lucretia and they went back to the Roman Forum and they displayed it for everybody to see. And they made a speech about how this was the example of this terrible cruelty that was upon them from the king and his sons, and it was only going to get worse. And so the Romans, who were so angered by this, decided to take up arms and revolt against their king. Not only that, but the soldiers who were with the king also deserted him and decided to revolt. And so the king and his sons were driven out of Rome, and they fled back to their people, the Etruscans, else they knew they would be killed. And then Collatinus and Brutus came back into the town square, into the forum, and they said, "Let us never again have a king. Let us establish a new form of government called a republic. For now, we will establish a temporary form until we can flush it more out and make it more detailed." And so the people chose Collatinus and Brutus to rule together for 1 year as what they called consuls. And so they would have equal power, which meant that they would have to figure out how to agree on things. And they would establish the law and ensure that justice was carried out in Rome. And this was the beginning of the Roman Republic. We'll hear more about it as we go. And so this was the end of the monarchy, the beginning of something new. Now, just to say, we in our modern times, I should say this, I don't know if this is true for all of you watching around the world, but in the United States where I live, we have a republic. That is, the form of government we have. I know in other countries where people may be watching, there are parliamentary systems, which are, structured in a similar way as the U.S. government, which is to say that officials are elected. They're elected by vote of the people, and then they themselves have to vote on issues within the Senate or the Parliament or the House of Representatives. Like I said, we'll talk more about that as we go. I want to leave you with this question. Is it always better to have a republic? Are there ever instances where it's better to actually have a king or a queen, a single monarch ruling? And I'll give you an example. So the country of Tibet, I'm going to call it a country, even though technically the Chinese say it's part of China right now, but I'm going to call Tibet its own country. And before the Chinese ruthlessly invaded and took it over, they had what's called a theocracy. The Dalai Lama, who you might have heard of, was the head of their government. And so, ultimately, the big decisions were made by the Dalai Lama, who is considered kind of like a living Buddha. So he was not a tyrant at all. He was somebody who ruled from, to the best of his ability, from love and compassion. So there's the question. Is it always better to have a republic? Or might there be some cases where a monarchy is better? And tomorrow we're going to hear about the plebeians and the patricians, which is another way of saying the age-old struggle between rich and poor, and how that presented itself in ancient Rome. Okay, so I want you to get out your notebook, your outline from yesterday, and a pencil, and let's go to that now. Alrighty, so let's work on this. So we got the outline from yesterday, and I'm going to use my main lesson book to write. And as always, what I recommend for you is that you do a rough copy first in this book, okay? I would skip lines, okay? And then edit it. You should always look over and edit your own work, and then have somebody else, like an adult, do it. But I'm going to just show you then for the final copy, what I would ask you to do is do a red border on your page. And you may end up needing 2 pages for this, depending on how much detail you put in. Okay, and we're going to call this composition the founding of Rome. So you can do this with me now in your main lesson book if you want, or you can do it later after you've written the draft of your composition and edited it. All right. We're going to say the founding of Rome. I'm going to do it first in print. Of Rome. And then I'll add the little flags as I've been doing. Soon we're going to learn how to do some calligraphy. Now we can write our titles in calligraphy, which is a really fun thing to do. Founding of I didn't mean for this to look like a P. I admittedly went a little bit far down with my F. Okay, so we have our outline here. And I'm going to get a blank sheet of paper to use as a word cloud. So go ahead and pause the video and get yourself a blank sheet of paper. Go ahead and do that now. So I got my blank sheet, and I'm going to remember what I wrote yesterday. So the desire to found the city and all that's part of that, the need to agree on the hill, using augury, Romulus winning, proclaiming himself king, Remus resentful. The building of the city. So these will be by paragraphs, right? So first, second, third, fourth paragraph. The weed seed ritual, the ox plow, the wall building. Number 3, the conflict between the brothers. This will be the third paragraph. And so these main headings can be your topic sentence for each paragraph. And I am assuming you know what a topic sentence is by now. But if you don't, it's like a sentence that introduces what you're going to talk about. It's kind of like a sign that's outside of a room. It says like, this is the ballroom. And so, you know, it's kind of announcing the ballroom. So you go, oh, okay, that's what's going to be inside this room. And so you go in and you see all the stuff that's in the ballroom. Right? So for this paragraph, conflict between the brothers, you might say something like, there was conflict brewing between the brothers, you know, and then you explain it in the paragraph. Remus taunting Romulus, Remus jumping over the wall, Romulus slaying Remus. And then finally, the city of outlaws, too much open space, King Romulus wants subjects, invites outlaws, thieves, murderers to live in Rome. Okay, so with a word cloud, you can make a little cloud here, and you want to just write down artistic words, descriptive words that we could use. Let's think about the first paragraph, founding the city. So they couldn't agree. They were maybe quarrelsome. You can write these words down that I'm coming up with. You can also add some of your own. And then, Romulus wins. Maybe he exclaims that he has more birds. It's a good word, exclaims. And he proclaims himself king, maybe proudly, arrogantly. You could say maybe he was neglectful of his brother, right? And Remus was resentful. Maybe he was burning with resentment. You can even write phrases like this, burning with resentment. Okay, then the building of the city, the wheat seed ritual, the ox plow, the wall building. What are some good words for that? Set to work. We worked diligently, right, on the wall. Because remember, you're writing it from the perspective of the shepherd, so you would be helping to build the wall. Then there was conflict between the brothers. I'm going to write brewing here and talking about conflict, not beer. Okay, and then Remus taunting Romulus. You could say, getting under his skin. Under his skin, right? That's a good one. Remus jumps over the wall, maybe mockingly. And then Romulus slays Remus out of maybe rage, out of, you could say cold blood is usually when somebody does something without regret. Because remember, he said, and so shall this happen to anybody who dares cross the walls of Rome. Okay, then the city of outlaws. So too much open space. King Romulus wants subjects. He's power hungry, maybe? You think? He invites outlaws, thieves, murderers to live in Rome. How do you feel about that? Maybe uneasy? I would. So remember, you're writing this from your perspective. You should be truthful to the facts, but then you can also put in some of your own experience. So I'm going to invite you now to do this on your own. See what you can come up with. And I'm going to write my own, and paragraph by paragraph, I'm going to reveal it and read to you what I've got as an example. I don't want you to copy mine. I don't want you to do the same thing as me. I want you to write about the same things. Maybe use some of the same words, but put it in your own sentences. And of course, your own reactions. Maybe you're okay with the outlaws. Maybe you feel like you're one of them. Maybe you're like, yeah, those are my people. All right, so I'm going to pause my filming and do some writing. And then I'll come back when the first paragraph is done. All right, here we go. I was with our fearless leaders, Romulus and Remus, when they decided to build their city by the river Tiber. They quarreled over which of 7 hills to build upon, and finally they used augury to decide. Romulus exclaimed he had more birds fly over his hill. He proudly proclaimed himself king and named the new city Rome after himself. I thought to myself, this won't go over well, since Remus became full of resentment. Okay. I'm going to go on to the next paragraph now. Second paragraph. What could I do, though? I had to follow my new king, and we began to build the city. King Romulus dug a hole, threw in some wheat seeds, and we filled it in with dirt. We all cheered with excitement when the gods responded with a clap of thunder and a bolt of lightning. Then we had some oxen plow a furrow, and we diligently began to build the wall. Okay, third paragraph. All right, we got the next paragraph here. It wasn't long, however, before conflict erupted between the brothers. Romulus had neglected his brother's wish to share power, and Remus repaid that treachery. Forgot to cross my T here. Repaid that treachery with taunting. He was really getting under Romulus's skin, who was getting red with rage. The last straw was pulled when Remus mockingly jumped over the wall. Romulus drew his sword and slew his brother. In cold blood he followed that with, and so shall all meet the same fate who try to cross these walls. We all felt bad after that, but he was our king, so we kept working. All right, and then do the fourth paragraph. And finally, we have, Rome was to become a rough place. We were few, and our power-hungry king wanted to rule over many. He therefore invited the worst of the worst to live amongst us, outlaws, thieves, and murderers. This is a dash, by the way. The worst to live amongst us, outlaws, thieves, and murderers. I mean, sure, I took a couple sheep from time to time, mostly in revenge. These guys were bad news, though. Good thing we all had plenty of space. All right. So there's an example of what you could have done. So you see I'm writing it from a certain perspective. And so that will be all for this lesson. So thank you very much, and I will see you for the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.